Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Sisk, and I'm staff at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, which is hosting this Earth Week seminar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm speaking from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, and part of Treaty 13, which is held by the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. The lands are also covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. We acknowledge that people in this online space are on the traditional territories of many different Indigenous nations across the lands now called Canada. We acknowledge the sacred connection between Indigenous people and the lands that they have held and cared for from time immemorial, and the ongoing care that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have shown and continue to show for the land. As we mark Earth Week 2025, we do so mindful that the impacts of the climate crisis, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss have harmed people and the ecosystems we live in, and that those harms have fallen disproportionately on people in the global south and in Canada on Indigenous nations and racialized communities. Settler colonization in Canada is marked by breaking connections to and displacing Indigenous peoples from their lands. So as we lean into the call of Earth Day as a movement to seek ways of living more sustainably on the earth, it is critical that we do so in ways that uphold Canada's responsibilities to truth and reconciliation and upholding the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. The general chat function is off, but hosts are receiving messages and questions. Grace is our tech support person. Please message her with any tech questions or issues that you may be having. Thank you, Grace, for doing this. Anything else can be sent to me in the chat. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted online afterwards, and a link of the recording will be shared with anyone who registered. We are together today for 1 hour, and most of that time will be with our speaker, but there will be time for questions, which you can send to me in the chat. The Presbyterian Church in Canada is hosting this webinar, but it's only one of dozens of events that are going on in faith communities across Canada as part of Earth Week, and which is being promoted by the Faith-Based Coalition for the Love of Creation. For the Love of Creation works with faith groups and individuals that are seeking ways to faithfully respond to the climate crisis. Their website I will post in the chat, and I encourage anyone who's interested in seeking resources for their communities to take a look at the site. Finally, if anyone is interested in the Presbyterian Church in Canada's actions and resources, we have the Social Action Hub, which is both a history of the church's actions on different social justice topics, including the climate crisis, and it's also a place to find resources for congregations and groups in the church, and I will also include that link in the chat. Our speaker today is Dr. Leora Gainsworth. Dr. Gainsworth is Anishinaabe Kwe, a community-engaged scholar and Anishinaabe geographer. Her professional work draws from Anishinaabe legal traditions, including relationships and responsibilities to water. She'll be speaking about how changes to land and water uniquely impact the intergenerational lives of Indigenous peoples and all our relations, including birds, fish, plants, and others, and we'll share some examples of how faith and action might work together to pursue Mino, Bimadizoin, an Anishinaabe concept that talks about pursuing a good and balanced life. Dr. Gainsworth, thank you for your work and for being with us today.
Miigwech, Catherine, and miigwech to everybody for being here today. I trust you can hear me okay. Good to see you all. Good to see the names and faces on the Zoom screen here. So again, my name is Leora Gainsworth, and Musqueam Indigenous Cause. May make any big nindodem, Amami Winini Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao, Abading Deo, Gaya, Gitchikibekong, and Donjaba Nungwa. So today I'm calling in from the area of Niagara, which is not far from those who are in Toronto. And this area is historically a very relevant site to Anishinaabe and other First Nations, as well as tribal nations on the state side who have a long history with remembering that this place is a sacred site of connection between thunder and water. So I always think about that because it's a beautiful place to be in, despite the decades of environmental degradation that have happened. My understanding is the spirit of that place remains strong and continues to be life-giving for all those who respect and honor its history. So that is also the territory of the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee people. and I give great thanks for having the privilege to be on those lands today. And I've got, several slides here, maybe 13 or so, where I'll just sort of share some concepts and ideas drawing from my work that is about like a 13 or 14-year career now looking at Indigenous environmental justice and priorities related to land restoration, reclamation, and reconciliation. So in Canada, reconciliation carries a specific, connotation and meaning, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I really appreciate the introduction, Catherine, and the invite to be with you all today. And I hope we have a great discussion after I share my thoughts and ideas with you. So again, I offered up my name and an Anishinaabe way of being. We're given our spirit names that help us to understand what is our identity as a person and as a spirit. And so my name is very much related to water and the caretaking of water, specifically types of water bodies such as wetlands and other areas that are so important for the filtration and cleanliness of water. And so when a person or a child, sometimes people receive their spirit name late in life. I did. I didn't receive mine until I was close to 30 years old. But often in the time of my ancestors, those names were given to a child even before the child was born. And so the child is sort of born into their purpose, right? And so thinking about that in terms of how we construct what I call the life world, right? The way that we live our life, how we show up for our work in the world, that's all part of our language, our cultural history, and our ceremonial history and our spirituality. And so that's what I have devoted myself to for the last several years. And so that kind of gives me a series of responsibilities, both to my intergenerational biological family, but as well as the world around me, the different animals that live in areas like wetlands, such as turtles, frogs, etc. And so Dabajimoanan is a word in our language that means to tell personal stories and to tell the stories of our everyday experience. So most of my discussion today will be informed by Dabajimoanan, how I apply these concepts to my life. But I also want to be very respectful and clear that this knowledge does have an origin, right? This is not something that I'm sort of making up on my own accord. And our knowledge systems are complex and related to the language, spiritual practice, and the culture of origin. And Anishinaabe lands are vast. There's a lot of area to cover, and I'll sort of share a map of that shortly. But I just wanted to start with that first of all, because these days, the world that we're in, we live in a very complex world with, multilinguistic representation. There's so many languages, worldviews, religions that all share a place. And so Anishinaabe creation story and way of being is ancient and enduring from a time long before Canada ever existed. And so that's where I'm trying to always sort of be aware of the ancestry that I come from, as well as taking what can be applied today, given that the world has changed so much. But there's a lot that continues to persist. So I have two kind of visuals here, and I have a huge screen, so I can see the tiny writing. I apologize if it's not showing up on other people's screen, but I can kind of walk us through both of these. So on the left, we have what it's called a cosmogram, and it was created by Dr. John Burroughs, who writes about Anishinaabe law and reconciling Anishinaabe and Canadian law. And so the quadrants here represent the four directions of the universe. So on the right, we have the east, and then the south on the bottom, and the west to the left, and on the top quadrant is the north. So those directions tell us a lot about how we might understand our place in the world as human beings. So at the center of this diagram is also the four elements. So we have earth, air, fire, and water. And that is sort of the heart and the spirit of everything that we are to take care of as human beings. So when we look at that direction going from east to west, and all the way through that whole cycle, we see that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So those four directions are both a metaphor and a concrete observation of how we might think about how to understand our relationship between different aspects of the natural world, such as the seasons. So currently we're moving into we're in the spring season, Ziguan. And so during that spring season, that corresponds with the Eastern quadrant, which reflects new life. It also reflects childhood. It also is affiliated with the color yellow, which is related to the sun. And it's about that uh, coming on of spring is also about the pursuit of knowledge. So what are we going to learn in this new cycle as a new season is upon us? And then we know eventually that we move into the summer and we're in a stage of growth, right? Summer helps us to grow. It helps plants, berries, foods, other things to grow. But as we move toward the west, we see that we are starting to come into a space of reflection because we know that as the sun goes down every day, that's the end of that specific day, right? There will never be another day like today. And so as we come to that reflective stance and move towards the north, we start to think about what it means to develop new ideas and to be interdependent. So these are just some extrapolations of how this model could be used. I find the model very useful because it sort of has layers to it. And it's one interpretation of an Anishinaabe worldview that uses the four directions. So something I've learned over the past several years that's very interesting to me is that cultures around the world look at the four directions in unique ways. So I've learned that the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, have a specific orientation with the four winds. And there are other cultures in Africa, other First Nations cultures, tribal nations cultures in North America, and even in South and Central America that talk about the four directions. So that's just to say that human beings have a place in the world, and it's very dependent on what's happening in the realm of the stars, right? The stars and the moon and the way that they interplay with seasons and other things. The other model here on the right comes from the work of an organization based in Bothwell, Ontario. It's called the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and they have been doing research for a number of years about mental wellness, holistic wellness, and taking care of life through an Indigenous lens. So what they did was they went all around to all the elders and as many elders and knowledge keepers as they could in North America, and asked about what it means to be a whole and healthy person. So all these people were gathered up and they came up with the idea that in order to feel like a whole and healthy person, we need to have a sense of hope. People need to have a sense of hope, and that creates spiritual wellness. And people also need to have a sense of belonging, which is corresponding with emotional wellness. People need to have a sense of meaning in their lives, and that supports mental wellness. And people need to have a purpose. So that is how physical wellness is understood, is through expressing one's purpose. So I mentioned these together again to say that all parts are connected when we're thinking about what it means to engage with concepts like climate justice, reconciliation. It's not just one piece, it's the holistic expression of Mino Bimadziwen. So Mino Bimadziwen is often translated to mean living a good life or living the good life. But at the same time, from what I've come to understand through several years of language and other cultural exposure, is that it's also about balancing, because nothing is ever going to be perfect, right? But we have to make an effort to balance all these factors throughout our lives. And so when we think about reconciliation, I'm not sure, you never know. I mean, sometimes people are extremely familiar with reconciliation, and some are less familiar and only know the word. But just so we're all on the same page, the 94 calls to action that were released 10 years ago were the result of interacting with over 6,000 residential school survivors and their family members and other witnesses who were part of the residential school system. And the purpose of the residential school system was expressly to remove children from their family structures, from their lands, and to to essentially to make them feel ashamed of who they were. And so when we think about reconciliation as a specific attack on families and children, that helps us to understand why it's so important to be asking questions about land. And the 94 calls to action are one document in a series of documents, thousands upon thousands of pages of those testimonies of survivors explaining exactly what the methods were to make them feel ashamed of who they were for being Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee or whatever language, family, and cultural, spiritual family they come from. So I think it's very important to remember that, and to remember that these knowledge systems that I'm talking about through these models are in fact very sophisticated and holistic and have multiple dimensions to them, and are not to be dismissed as primitive knowledge, right? Because so often that's what Indigenous people are thought of as being, primitive and behind the times and holding up progress. And that definitely appears in climate discourse as well. So I can talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to just give a visual to those two things. I also wanted to mention the 94 calls to action. There are several that mention the need to repudiate the doctrine of Christian discovery, which is also a really important conversation. But at the same time, these are also really important calls to action that talk about land, the specific role of land in reconciliation. So it's really about looking at reconciling Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders to make Indigenous, the word they use is Aboriginal, and now 10 years later, we're using Indigenous more commonly. But in the common law, Aboriginal is the word that was often used. But to make Aboriginal peoples full partners in Confederation, including the recognition and integration of Indigenous laws and legal traditions, to look at land claims, treaties, and other negotiations. So that's actually really important. And well, a lot of that work is ongoing to see that come to pass, right? And a lot of this work falls on Indigenous legal professionals, scholars, practitioners, knowledge keepers, elders to do that work, right? At the same time, though, it is a responsibility of both treaty partners in some cases. So if we're talking about treaties, we're in areas a lot of the times where there are numbered treaties or other treaties that exist. The community I come from, which is Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe, it's about an hour and a half north of Ottawa. There's no treaty there. So there's not any treaty language to work from. So reconciliation has to be about understanding Algonquin Anishinaabe law and how that applies to being in a place where the land was never surrendered. The other thing to know about treaties that I think is also really important is that, treaty doesn't mean surrender. It's a framework for how to live together and how to live well together. The other important call to action is number 75, which is about the federal government's role in working with governments at all levels, churches, Aboriginal communities, residential school students, survivors, landowners, etc., to look at sacred sites and other sites where residential school children did not survive. And so that's been a topic in the news and so on, and has unfortunately also opened the door to denialism about whether or not these schools have had the historically negative impact that has been so commonly discussed. And so I don't really want to open that too much, but just to acknowledge that those debates and those conversations are out there. But I think another big important part of this language is about sacred sites, right? And what it means to care for a burial site. And so that's very important in my own tradition and my own understanding. As Anishinaabe, we need to take care of those who've passed on as they're reinterred to the earth. And so there is no real formalized protection for those sites, legally speaking, in a lot of areas. So that's another way to maybe, for the way that I think about reconciliation regarding land and land use. And so those are just some of the considerations around how reconciliation applies to some of the work that I do. But there's certainly several other aspects of reconciliation to think about. So there's calls to action related to healthcare and education and all these other pieces, child welfare, murdered and missing women. There was another inquiry in 2018 that talked about that as well. So there's definitely a lot of documentation out there. And again, this may be like a review for a lot of people, but at the same time, there's so much information. I like to just kind of grab a part of it and say, this is where I'm focusing, right? So those are all really important and useful items, the reports and documents that are widely available online. as government publications. And it's also important to know that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was in, the late 90s and showed a lot of the same findings, that there needs to be a real understanding that the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of supremacy of Christianity over lands is really sort of a legal foundation that doesn't hold much teeth today, and is something that needs to be sort of worked through in terms of the people who have survived these efforts to eradicate who they are. And so I wanted to also give this kind of helpful visual here to orient us again to Anishinaabe. And so on the right, as of 2024, the red dots represent Anishinaabe reserves in Canada and the US. I think it's really helpful to look at that just to see how widespread the Anishinaabe communities are. And Anishinaabe also belong to the Algonquian language family. So even within that is larger, there's larger areas. So that refers to the map on the left. These are the sort of language families that exist across the Great Lakes and beyond. So where I come from, my mother's family comes from Algonquin Anishinaabe, which on this map shows as Old Algonquin, kind of up there in Western Quebec. And then you have Ojibwe and different areas in Ojibwe country, Oji-Cree, and even to the north that doesn't appear in this map, you also have like James Bay Cree and others. So we're distinctive peoples, but related language families. And I think that's really crucial to understanding our relationships to lands and territories. On my father's side, he belongs to the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations, and that's a completely different language family and culture, right? So when we think about the 600 plus First Nations alone that are in Canada, that shows a tremendous diversity, as well as Métis and Inuit peoples who are also very diverse and have their own histories and relationships. And when we think about it that way, I think it helps to kind of widen the conversation a little bit to help us realize that, each area is dependent on land and on their landscape and what lands they have access to today, in the midst of the colonialism that continues to persist. So I like to also think about, again, knowing that we're not going backwards here. I'm not trying to force us all to live in wigwams again or something like that, but our ancestors did leave us a lot of wisdom and a lot of understanding of the natural world that we can draw from. And when I think about how my interaction and relationship with time, that's where I think about the role of paying attention to the moon cycles. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I became involved in a project that was about Indigenous youth and climate justice through my work with the incredible and amazing Deborah McGregor of York University, where I was a student at the time, and later went into be involved in some of her climate justice projects. And we started a project that relates to the 13 moons. Or actually, I should not say that. It's the 13 moon cycle because there's only one moon. And again, I mean, some of this knowledge and way of thinking through the years has been understood by others who practice other ways as, as not worthwhile or pagan knowledge or something like that. And what I find today is that when I'm looking at the phenomena of what's happening in the natural world with the weather and water conditions and bird migration, fish migration, and trees ripening and not ripening, and plants and flowers, and all the different expressions of creation. That is, I think, my greatest teacher, right? Because you start to see a consistency or a lack of consistency through time. And that's how we continue to develop our baseline understanding of what is actually happening in the natural world. And we compare that with the stories of our ancestors, that helps us to see, where we actually are and how the earth is changing. There's also, of course, Western science and Western scientific models, but the stories that come from understanding and recording data within the 13 moon cycle are really helpful. So as we move into April, and we're moving out of April and into May, we're moving into Wabugungisis, which is flower moon. And so I think we can all have a great appreciation for the flowers. that will be coming. And it also, again, corresponds back to that spring season and seeking knowledge and coming into fruition, right? And so the 13 moon calendar and cycle corresponds with the Mesquares, which is a turtle, a painted turtle. And there's a lot of beautiful stories of turtles and their role in creation for us and to us. And so when we understand how to read the back of a turtle and how to keep our observations today, that does again help us with understanding how the moon moves through these different cycles and what we should be expecting in each of those moons. And so when, birds are moving differently or if flowers are blooming differently than they used to, again, that helps us to understand, where we are and how we might compare current conditions to past conditions. And the earth, in our understanding as Anishinaabeg, is a living being and is understood to be female and very much related to the cycles of the moon and how the moon moves the waters, right? And so when we're paying attention to that seasonality, we're paying attention to the stars, that helps us to understand even if you follow the progression of a day every day, right? It's like we can almost see that birth, death, and rebirth cycle in a day, starting with the very first light at the break of dawn, and then moving through a slow progression as we move toward the invisibility of the sun, right? And then the descent of darkness that leads us to night. And that helps us, again, to think about how we're always engaging in this sort of cyclical rhythm that enables us to live, really, because there are very few parts of this, the universe where human life can be supported. Maybe Mars is starting to look that way. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, but we definitely know Earth. We have a relationship to Earth, and the minerals of the earth are in our bodies as well. So we have, a deep relationship in relation to our mother, which is the earth, who is the earth. And so again, the big basis of my work in geography and other areas is very much about trying to extrapolate, that relationship and that understanding that comes from respecting and honoring the earth as our mother, and all the diversity within that. So I've never had a chance to travel to, what's this part of the world that we see on the screen here. But I imagine, from what I've learned through scholarship and other things is, all the people around the world were given a way of understanding the earth. And it's our privilege to be able to try to seek that, because it teaches us again about Mino Bimadzu and about pursuing that balanced way of living. So for Anishinaabe, also Anishinaabe Kwe refers to a woman, and Kwe and Nibe is water. There's a deep relationship there because women are the carriers of water. So women traditionally take care and protect water both in the watershed and within their own bodies. And as caretakers of children and families, women generate water. The child lives in the first lodge of the woman's body. And so those responsibilities tell us as well about the stewardship and care of watersheds and the natural world. The world we see today is not necessarily informed by that sort of thing. It's informed very much by more of a scientific and technical understanding that I'm not really at liberty to speak on the gender of it, because I think it's more diverse than might seem. But at the same time, when we're thinking today about what's happened to water and the conditions of water all throughout Anishinaabe territories, we see a lot about the boil water advisories, the lack of access to clean water, the lack of access to like recreational opportunities that others take for granted, being moved onto the reserve system and given less access to other types of infrastructure to be able to leave out of those territories. Not always true. I mean, there's definitely, like I said, over 600 First Nations that have different access to these things, but disproportionately, First Nations people and communities suffer from issues around water in Canada specifically. There's clear examples at Six Nations and elsewhere that are so decades long lack of access to clean water. And so when we think about concepts of justice and how that might be sort of understood through an Indigenous lens, there's a couple different concepts that I find really helpful. So there is this amazing scholar by the name of Maria Looking Horse Braveheart that comes from the Oceti-Sakowin Lakota people. And her work looked at historical trauma. So very similar framing and research methods as Canadian reconciliation policies, right? Talking to people who are intimately affected by these things. Just have to plug in my computer. And finding that survivors of colonization experience a range of, whoops, that plug threw me for a loop. Okay, Braveheart's research talked about how a lot of survivors of colonialism and reservation systems, reserve systems, and that separation are informed by deep military presence and state narrative of conquest and land ownership, etc. So there's everyday reminders built into the natural world that the dispossession of Indigenous people is structural, right? So that can lead people into a sense of, hypervigilance, but also alienation from their responsibilities as caretakers of water or other elements. And so, again, Deborah McGregor, who took that framing in a different direction and talked about the historical trauma that's happened to water, is kind of the intervention point where my work sits, because it's both involving the holistic wellness of human beings, but it also relates to the ways in which our water has received trauma. So if you think about water as a living entity and you think about all the different sources of trauma and pollution that water receives, for me, that equates to like a war that we're having against water, sometimes not even with our own consciousness, right? It's built into everything that we do. And so from perspectives of scientific understandings of water often reflect very technical language. This is a clear, odorless, colorless liquid, that has, expression all around different types of environments. So there's, rainwater or lake water or river water, different things like that. So we get into these sort of technical categories. But when you look at the map on the right, it's cut off on the top, which is unfortunate. I didn't realize that. But we can get the picture here of all the different ways that water receives so much overwhelm, right? So it's in the form of oil spills, sludge. In the Great Lakes, there's shipwrecks that are just sort of sitting in the bottom of the water, industrial runoff, urban runoff, combustion, sewage treatment facilities, septic tanks, abandoned mines, ongoing mines, algae, surface runoff, farms, livestock, factories, landfills, all these things. And I'm not saying that Indigenous peoples are not part of that, because oftentimes this is what we conceive as civilized modern infrastructure, right? But when we're thinking about, why we need to be working together as communities, looking at environmental intergenerational justice, the teachings of our ancestors as Anishinaabe can help us understand, what constitutes a healthy environment. So otters, as we see here in the picture, are part of a healthy environment. And when we think about climate justice, again, we're not going backwards here, but we do need to be informed by what are good living conditions for the environment that we're living in. So in the case of, say, Toronto or even Niagara or any of the areas around the Great Lakes, Anishinaabe people and other Indigenous nations and peoples who've lived there for hundreds of years, pre-Confederation, have a lot of that knowledge because the memory tells about what people used to eat, what people used to do, what were the seasonal ceremonies, what are the baseline conditions, right? And so when I look into that, my work has sort of grown to think about, okay, well, what has happened to the land and water where I live? What are the relatives, both human and non-human, that can tell us about those conditions? And what I've come up with for several years now, over a decade, which is really crazy, almost a decade and a half, I've been researching the decline of keystone fish species. And the one that stands up to me the most is the American eel. So this is a picture of myself holding an American eel that was pulled from the Delaware River down on the New York-Pennsylvania border. And so something to know about the American eel is that it is beautiful. It is a being of creation, and therefore it is beautiful. And a lot of people think it's not beautiful, maybe think it looks like a snake or that it's slimy or has some sort of, inherent disgust surrounding it because of the way it appears. And I would say that could be true for a lot of animals, right? Not all animals fit our aesthetic of what's beautiful. But at the same time, the decline of American eels is really, really sort of tied to industrialization and to modernization and to the development of dams and culverts and other forms of infrastructure for like a petroleum-based economy. And so that is something that we all live with today, right? And so the behaviors that we have in terms of on-demand electricity through hydro facilities, which are privately owned, and the benefits are more private than they are public, right? In terms of financial profit. Those are all related to why eels can't migrate into their home habitat. So when I think about climate justice, I look for ways to take the conceptual and make them sort of locally specific, right? So how is this locally specific? How is the concept of justice integrated with and contributing to conditions in the natural world determined by and for Indigenous peoples, intergenerational, and focuses on the wellness of all our relations. So again, that holism. And for the intergenerational part, something that I used to hear even as a child was that 1 to 2 generations ago, there were still large runs of American eels coming through rivers. And again, this is like prior to World War II, because after World War II was when there were a lot of dams that were built. But the eels used to be such a big part of the cycle of migratory fish and other animals. So I have a map here that shows us the migration range. And so if you look to the right, the Sargasso Sea is out off the coast of Bermuda, and that's where the life cycle of an American eel starts. And they go all the way up towards Greenland. They have a really far range, over 3,000 kilometers in some cases. Some of them just stay on the coastline, but some of them come into the rivers. So the dark shaded area is where there's known American eel habitat in Canada and the US. So they have this very long migration range. And as they're migrating, they're growing and metamorphosing, and they have a symbiotic relationship with mussels. So they provide water filtration, and they provide they are prey animals for larger like raptors and herons and otters and others. But they also eat a lot of the carrion that are in the waterways. So they kind of act as cleanup in that way as well. So you can imagine the impact of what it means to have a 99 to 100% decline of American eels throughout all of these watersheds. It affects the water quality. And when the water quality is affected, there's also related issues such as mercury contamination and other exposure. Something else to know about eels is that they bioaccumulate fat into their bodies. And as they bioaccumulate, they also can bioaccumulate heavy metals. So again, with the shipwrecks and other heavy metals that are in the waters, that affects them. Anything that we put into the toilet system, so like drugs or other things, they bioaccumulate all of that, PCBs, plastics, etc. So it's important to realize that in looking at this one organism, we can see sort of a mirror of our behavior in the natural world. So when I'm thinking about climate justice, contributing to improve conditions for an American eel is really taking all those components of interspecies, intergenerational restoration of an area to think about the huge, enormous, overwhelming instance of climate change and how that trickles down into the macro level of eel migration. So sometimes early on in the migration, when eels are coming in during the spring, the eel run just completed up near the Hudson Valley, from what I understand. It started in late February or actually in early February. It started earlier this year. And they came in from the Sargasso Sea in the early spring. They're tiny, right? They're so tiny. They're not even as big as like a pinky finger. And yet they provide so much to the watersheds as they grow. So they grow inland and they stay for up to 20 to 30 years, and then they go back out to the Sargasso. So they're very unique in that way. And they're related to a total of 19 anguillid species around the world. This is the only anguillid species in the Western Hemisphere that comes to the Americas. So I consider this fish to be very special. And again, it was part of our baseline conditions, and it also fed our ancestors. It was very popular with early colonists. It sustained a lot of people throughout the years. It's fallen out of culinary favor today, but I still feel that we owe eels a tremendous amount for all that they've done for us through the generations. So when I'm thinking about, what are the benefits of eel restoration, it's about water quality and the work that I do with scientists and with faith leaders in Indigenous communities and in other areas. It connects all of us, right? It's a connector. It brings us all together to have these conversations about the conditions of the watersheds, how we might care about water, what's missing in our water systems, in terms of specific animals, but also in terms of like governance approaches. How do we reconcile ourselves with water? How do we reconcile with our removal from our homelands and territories as Indigenous people? But also, how do we restore space for native birds, insects, mammals, and other habitat, which again is all part and parcel of reconciliation with the earth. So doing this type of thing helps us to have a shared story and not a singular story. Because I think what's happened in the case of nation states in a settler colonial context is that we're sort of forced to adapt one story and say this is the story of a place or a country um, or our collective. But if each of us tells our story, we see that the mosaic of life is a lot richer and a lot more diverse than a singular story can hold, really. So some final thoughts I wanted to just kind of wrap up with are about our dependency on the earth. We all depend on the earth to survive. Everything that we have comes from the earth. Our body returns to the earth when we die. The beauty and strength of biodiversity are sort of our universal teachers. So when we tune into the earth, into the elements, that helps us to understand our collective humanity. And so because we know that there's so many different forms of peoplehood that live in our homelands, right? Different languages, different cultures, spiritual traditions, etc. Our awareness of that has grown so much as Anishinaabe. The world has come to live in our homelands. So our question continues to be, how do we create Minohimatsuan in harmony with all those peoples? And reconciliation is about it primarily originates in Canada from stories of residential schools, and the suffering of families and children must be honored and recognized as an effort to remove people from land. And so looking today at land return and restoration, it's a contribution to holistic justice that everybody has a part in, but for me is very much special to Indigenous children and the coming generations. So I have talked nonstop for 40 minutes and I hope some of that was helpful toward the topic of today. And Miigwech Vizindawek, thanks for listening to me. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Leah, for your wisdom today, for giving us ways to think about healing and well-being for people on the planet that are grounded in Anishinaabe legal traditions and knowledge, and particularly tied to particular lands and waters and stories of animals in those lands and waters, and putting it through the lens of colonization, and what are the needs to hold. What do we need to hold together these intersections of responding to environmental crises and our responsibilities for reconciliation? Really appreciate that. We've come to our point where we are open for any questions. Thank you. I have a question. Are there any promising initiatives you would want to highlight that are working towards reconciliation with a particular focus on the land and environment?
Yes. I mean, I think of this in terms of like local, again, initiatives that are happening in specific places. So recently I had the privilege to attend an event at the Georgian Bay Biosphere, on Wasauksing First Nation. There was a small event there, and I learned about the work that local biospheres are trying to do to integrate, and understand Indigenous knowledges and the perspectives of the Indigenous communities where their work is taking place. And I've also sort of seen on a national level a lot of initiatives that relate to trying to understand, the very overarching complexity of trying to, for example, implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, right? So I want to give a sort of mention to Kabewik First Nation, who are located on the Ottawa River, who are a sister community of ours. They've been leading a lot of efforts to oppose a nuclear waste facility that was cited specifically for being adjacent to the Ottawa River. And so they have been doing a lot of important legal work to defend that territory, to support the bears, the Blandings turtles, and other important species that would be affected by that nuclear waste facility. And so I would say that it's piecemeal in a lot of ways, but there are communities that are really leading the charge for land defense. And that's really important because when we're looking at the lands and waters, it's, of course, it's related to human beings, but at the same time, we have a duty as human beings to work with and protect those who are vulnerable to our infrastructure.
Thank you. Another question. Elver fishery in Atlantic Canada has caused division and violence as people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with little regard to the health of the American eel. How can we create balance between economics and the environment?
I love that question, and I totally agree that that's an important point of conversation. And I think when we look at the histories of Indigenous people and their exclusion from fisheries and their exclusion from other types of economic ventures that are afforded to others, that is also not considered in part of that conversation. Yet, specifically for elvers and American eels, I think that there needs to be more clear and direct education about the holistic nature of the species and its migration. Because I think that there is a lack of understanding overall scientifically about the migration that still needs clarification in some ways, right? Like, so if and it could go for any animal. So if you're, say, for example, taking baby eagles out of a nest and putting them somewhere else, what does that mean about their original home? And what does that mean about their parents and their family? So that might be a little bit simpler because it's a bird, right? But with American eels, they have a panmictic breeding, which means that they just breed in the open ocean, as far as we understand scientifically. So it's sort of like if there's an eel, elver that's coming into um, the state of Maine, for example, or the state of New York, or even say further up into Prince Edward Island, its parents could have grown in Venezuela or South Carolina, but for some reason they're still trying to migrate into these areas, right? So I think for me, that is something that I'm interested in pursuing in dialogue with others about trying to gain a sense of understanding for how those sorts of ventures can be managed in an ethically and responsibly understood way.
Thoughts or questions? Are there other examples? I'm just gonna
Mhm.
I have a follow-up question based on that. And are there other examples of sort of the intersection of economics and the environment, where good stewardship or good ways of doing work are, can you think of of situations or examples of where those principles have helped and where those principles have made a difference?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a big one that a lot of people are pointing to these days is what is it called? It's in English, it's called the Buffalo Initiative, but it's about restoring the stewardship of American bison to Indigenous peoples. And it was initiated by and for Indigenous peoples across in a transboundary area. So it was really about giving them all, um, giving their voices privilege in the governance and restoration of and reintroducing American bison. And I think something that was really interesting to me recently was that I learned in um, in the country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, that at one time they have a different species. Eels are very meaningful to them over there, to the Maori and to their cultural history. And I learned that there was once a bounty on eels in Aotearoa because of they were said to compete with trout. So the introduction of other people's beliefs about what fish are valuable and what fish are not valuable and what fish belong in the water, et cetera, is common here and it's common there. So when the Maori were talking about um, the bounty on eels, it made me think of the bounty on buffalo. And there's a great book called Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk that talks about the deliberate effort to clear the plains and remove the food source for indigenous people by killing all the bison. And so that reintroduction initiative to me is so powerful and so beautiful again because the sacredness of that animal and its symbolic teachings and its literal teachings to the people who depend on it. So I think that initiative is probably the best example. And I know there's other efforts like that are still being pursued to protect other species, such as caribou and others. And there's a lot that the indigenous peoples are putting forth to do that.
Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned the need for clear education. Are there resources that you would recommend that church leaders can draw on for examples when preaching about ecological protection so that we can be part of that educational work?
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on your audience, there's like different audiences for say like policy or other things. And so the Indigenous Climate Justice Project at York University has sort of a nice they have a website and they have a bibliography of, sort of items that are often research based or based on science, scientific or integrative science or other things or legal approaches. So, I mean, on the one hand, you could take it that way, but there's also Indigenous organizations. So, Indigenous Climate Action is one, and there's others. And again, they're geared towards specific audiences. So, I think it's really a combination of like doing some reading and then sort of extrapolating, okay, what is most relevant to my constituency or the people that I'm preaching to in terms of their scope and range of practice, if that helps.
Thanks. Somebody said Kairos has resources.
Oh,
Kairos is
okay.
is an ecumenical organization. It's church based, but it works very hard to be inclusive or to include perspectives that are not necessarily from a colonial perspective, or to reflect a broader base of voices.
Yeah, I've been very, very deep in the weeds of a very specific literature right now. So I'm sure there are other resources out there. I'm probably just not up to snuff on them right now.
Yep, that was just a comment that had come in. Are there any other thoughts or questions for Dr. Gansworth before we close down for the afternoon? Thank you so much for showing how no being exists in isolation and for sharing your knowledge with us. Comes in.
Miigwech, thanks for having me and hope everybody has a great day today.